British actor Charles Laughton was one of the greatest actors of the 20th century. Sadly, today, he is not as well known as Sir Laurence Olivier, but in some ways Laughton could be just as good as Olivier, if not better, in some of his acting performances. What brought this to mind is that this past weekend, my dad and I watched the 13th installment of the BBC television series I, Claudius. I, Claudius was a famous BBC television series of the late 1970s, which gained enormous popularity and a large following in North America when it was shown on American PBS television back in the early 1980s. We got the DVD back in December and we've been watching it on and off, 1 or 2 episodes a week ever since. Last Thursday we watched the final installment of the TV series itself, episode 12, where Claudius eats poisoned mushrooms fed to him by Agrippina, the psychotic mother of the equally psychotic Emperor Nero, and as a result Claudius promptly kicks the bucket. But there was a bonus on this DVD, a 13th episode, if you will, a documentary that was done on BBC television back in the mid-1960s. The documentary was about British filmmaker Sir Alexander Korda's forgotten and unfinished epic movie of 1937, I, Claudius, the first time they attempted to film Robert Gray's famed 1934 novel, I, Claudius. The movie starred Charles Laughton as Claudius, Merle Oberon as Messalina, and Flora Robson as Livia. Surprisingly, this was the one London Films production that Korda did not direct himself. London Films was, of course, the name of Sir Alexander Korda's motion picture company. Instead, for I, Claudius, he was just the producer of the film, not the director. For the director, he hired a German-American named Joseph von Sternberg, the man who directed Marlene Dietrich in her breakthrough film in America, The Blue Angel. And so von Sternberg was hired to direct Korda's production of I, Claudius. Only a few scenes were shot in the film, and then the project was scrapped. Coincidentally, shooting on the film began on February 15th, 1937, and it was the wee morning hours of February 15th, 2009, exactly 72 years later, that my dad and I watched the documentary about the making of this unknown and unfinished and virtually forgotten film. The film, it turns out, was Charles Laughton's most difficult role. He was having a hard time trying to figure out how to bring Claudius to life. For Charles Laughton was one of those method actors who wanted to totally immerse himself in the character and become that character. It was this, of course, that made Laughton such a great actor. But he was having a hard time trying to capture Claudius, trying to become Claudius, trying to bring Claudius to life. In a 1965 interview with Merle Oberon for the documentary, she said that during the months of shooting for the film, Laughton would enter her dressing room and start crying on her shoulder for hours, saying, "I can't find Claudius. I just can't find Claudius. I can't bring Claudius to life." Needless to say, this caused numerous setbacks for the shooting schedule, and it led to much bitter fighting between von Sternberg, the director, and Laughton, the actor. Laughton was depressed, von Sternberg was depressed, and there was a feeling of tension and unease on the set. What finally killed the film was that Merle Oberon had a car accident after about a month of shooting into the film. Turns out Merle Oberon had a crazed chauffeur, and the jerk blew through a traffic intersection, crashing into another car and sending poor Miss Oberon flying through the windshield of the car. Remember, there were no seat belts in those days. Anyways, Merle Oberon's face was badly cut, and they didn't know if the scars would ever heal. And since Merle had shot so many scenes as Messalina, it would have been impossible to bring in a replacement for her. Not that Korda would have allowed them to anyways, since his purpose in making the picture was to make an epic greater than the Hollywood epics of the day, with his beloved Merle as the star. And since the picture was behind schedule anyways because of Laughton's angst and tensions between Laughton and von Sternberg, it was decided to just scrap the picture. Of course, Merle Oberon's facial scars did heal, but by the time they did, the chilling winds of impending war were already blowing across Europe, so no effort was ever made to finish the picture. In the few scenes that were shot with Merle Oberon as Messalina in I, Claudius, she made a priceless and far better Messalina than the one they cast in the mid-1970s BBC television production. And Flora Robeson made a far better Livia than the one cast in the mid-70s BBC production. Derek Jacobi was of course excellent as Claudius in that mid-70s BBC TV production. But how did he stack up against Laughton? Well, of course, not too many scenes were shot with Laughton as Claudius because of Laughton's personal angst in trying to capture the character. Who was the better Claudius, Laughton or Derek Jacobi? Well, when you watch the scenes with Laughton as Claudius in the film, Laughton did seem a bit unsure of himself at times. You could actually see on screen his angst in trying to capture the character. But, ironically, on the same day that Merle Oberon had her car accident, they shot the scene where Claudius, after the murder of Caligula, is dragged off by the Praetorian Guard to the chambers of the Roman Senate, where Claudius is acclaimed emperor. The night before the scene, Laughton had spent hours listening to a gramophone recording of King Edward VIII's abdication speech, in which Edward gave up the throne for the woman he loved, Mrs. Wallace Simpson. That morning, like a child, Laughton excitedly entered the studio, exclaiming with glee, "I found him! I found Claudius!" And, after watching that performance, where Laughton as Claudius had spoken to the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, my dad and I both fell silent at the end of the speech. It's what one does when one is in the presence of a great work of art. Like viewing the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, gazing at Michelangelo's Last Judgment on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or putting down a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, or having just listened to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I don't think I've ever seen, or probably ever will see, a better speech delivered on screen by an actor. It was even better than Sir Laurence Olivier's St. Crispin's Day speech from his performance as Shakespeare's King Henry V. For Laughton had indeed become Claudius. Sad that on the day this happened, Merle Oberon had a car accident and the picture was shelved. For what was probably the greatest film performance in all of motion picture history has sadly been seen by few as a result. Only those fortunate enough to watch that scene on that documentary about this forgotten film of Sir Alexander Korda would have seen it. And today, instead of wondering whether it was Sir Laurence Olivier or Sir Charles Gielgud who was the 20th century's greatest actor, there'd be no discussion. Laughton as Claudius, the silver screen's greatest performance, the 20th century's greatest actor.